Episode 10, Misleading Accessibility. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us as we explore the fighting game genre. Today we'll look at a very common misconception about accessibility, number of buttons. If you take an average player, who is not fully aware of the intricacies of the genre, and ask for their opinion, common sense would lead them to think that fewer buttons make for an easier game to play, and thus a more inviting and appealing game. Marketing departments tend to cater to people's preconceptions, even if false, in order to increase sales. This leads to many games that were designed with this and similar outside pressures in mind. In this episode, we're going to show you why this assumption is false, and why adding one or two more buttons will make the game easier to play, not harder. We'll show you that accessibility and other aspects of design often tend to be counterintuitive, and that first impressions, the wisdom of the crowd, can be deceiving. The main mistake here is that people tend to focus on a controller's face and shoulder buttons, but A, ignore the directionals, which are also buttons, and B, ignore the functions within the game itself. What you actually need to do is measure number of buttons against the number of options, or available moves, within the game. If you make a game with plenty of possible moves, but are forced to fit them all onto a small number of buttons, you have to resort to assigning moves to combinations of 2 buttons or more, which also includes direction plus button. Pressing 2 buttons at the same time, or a direction plus button, is inherently harder than pressing a single button. A good example is Virtua Fighter. The series only has 3 buttons: punch, kick, and block. On the surface, that sounds really easy to play, right? But since the move lists are still very big, many moves require multiple button presses, some of which are rather difficult to perform. It should be noted that some moves are purposely designed with a motion that slows down their execution as a balance mechanism. For example, a Dragon Punch would normally be too good as is if it could be done faster, with a single button press. Each move is designed with a motion that balances its in-game properties. But for now, let's focus on comparing between the instant options. What is better? Assigning a move to an extra button, to a combination of 2 or 3 existing buttons, or to a directional plus button? First of all, having multiple button presses forces you to tweak the size of the input window. For example, most Ultra moves in Street Fighter 4 require you to press the 3 punch or kick buttons almost at the exact same frame. The window is not lenient, and because of that, the move is inherently harder. Even good players sometimes mistime their Ultras. But perhaps the biggest problem with multiple button presses is the possibility of overlap. If 2 distinct moves require a similar input, trying to do a specific move may accidentally get you the other one. Personally, we find this single property one of the bigger sources of execution mishaps. Going back to Street Fighter 4, you'll notice in training mode that it's harder to do an Ultra when you are also able to do a Super. The motions overlap, and if you mistime the 3 button presses, the game thinks you wanted to do a Super move instead. Let's take BlazBlue as another example. The game has 4 buttons, and since one is drive, it usually leaves us with 3 attack buttons. But BlazBlue still has plenty of normals to spread around these 3 buttons, so it resorts to command normals. We think the game would be overall easier to play if it had an extra button instead of all the command normals. Mostly because many good normals that you want to do while dashing forward overlap with command normals done by forward plus button. This means that it's harder to do dashing moves during neutral or combos, and not get the unwanted forward plus button command normals. In Guilty Gear, the dashing neutral normals problem isn't as pronounced, because Guilty Gear has more buttons to work with, and because command normals usually don't overlap with the standing normals you want to dash in with. This means that Soul can easily poke with a dashing 5S, because there's no 6S normal that can come out by accident. So by adding an extra button for all the 6A and 6B moves, it would be easier to do dashing 5A or dashing 5B in BlazBlue. More buttons equals easier execution. If we still haven't managed to convince you yet, let's look at a very clear example of overlapping motions: Super Smash Bros. There's a common misconception that the Super Smash Bros. Games are easy to play, partly because they only have 2 attack buttons. But consider that the game is usually played by millions of casual players in a more relaxed and chaotic setting, where doing the right move exactly when you want is not that important. So this scenario is irrelevant to us for the sake of judging the control scheme accurately. Instead, imagine that you are playing in a tense 1v1 tournament, and let's examine the controls when every move matters. So you have two types of jumps, a regular jump and a short hop. Short hop is done by pressing the jump button and releasing it after a split second, exactly like in King of Fighters. The problem is that pressing a button only for a split second is unintuitive. When you are nervous and play under pressure, you tend to press buttons long and hard, not the other way around. And when you create an overlap by having both the short hop and the normal jump on the same button, you get many accidental normal jumps when you wanted short ones. The irony is that the game has two jump buttons that do the exact same thing, when it would be far easier to have one button for each type of jump. But that's not all. There are 3 different A attacks, which are all done with a similar input. 1. Moving the joystick slightly plus A is a tilt attack. 2. Moving the joystick all the way plus A is a smash attack. 3. And to top it off, moving the joystick all the way and pressing A a bit afterwards is a dashing attack. Like with the jump button issue, pressing a button or moving an analog joystick very specifically is hard and unintuitive. This means that you'll get many accidental smash attacks when you wanted to do tilt attacks. This overlapping also means that you'll be getting smash attacks when you wanted to do instant dash attacks instead. Adding another attack button goes against the easy to play myth, but would make Smash easier to play for real. Adding extra buttons is not some wacky experimental idea. It has been done before and worked great. Street Fighter went from 2 to 6 buttons. Guilty Gear added a dust button to cover what once needed 2 buttons. And both Melty Blood and Arcana Heart added a 5th button. All of these games became easier to play because these additional buttons resulted in fewer overlapping moves and execution errors. So what's the point of this long explanation? Don't be so quick to take people's word that a game is easy or hard simply because of its number of buttons, inclusion or exclusion of special move motions, or whatever other excuse is offered. If a game looks interesting to you, give it a fair shot and ignore all stigmas. You may be pleasantly surprised at what you discover. In the next episode, we'll talk about how the type of mastery a game requires changes its nature in casual and tournament play. Until then, take some time to think about what we presented, and if you liked the video, make sure to subscribe for more episodes. 何が出るかな